Hello, my name is Stephen Mansfield, and I would like to talk to you about how to lead in a time of crisis. I'm recording this at a time when we are all facing the coronavirus crisis, and I think it's a good time for us to draw from the rich life of Winston Churchill, surely one of the greatest leaders in history. Now, some of you may wish to know what your narrator looks like before we go much further. So again, my name is Stephen Mansfield, and here is my website, and here is how to contact me. All of my social media is essentially Mansfield Writes. But I don't want to talk about myself. I want to talk about Winston Churchill. In any survey of the great leaders of the 20th century, in fact, the great leaders of history, Winston Churchill tops the list. This is largely because he led the world in the opposition to the Nazis during World War II. This is also because, of course, he anticipated and warned the world about the descent of the Iron Curtain and our Western battles against communism. And so Churchill is a man very much revered, very much looked to. What people sometimes forget is how much crisis he had to face in his life of leadership. Just consider these crises and how Churchill was intimately involved in all of them, had to lead in the face of them. If he wasn't in a political office, he was sometimes actually in uniform and on the front lines of the battlefield. These were the crises of his life. And he faced them, and he taught us how to face them. And now, as we face coronavirus, and as we try to lead well, whether we're in business, or we are in politics, or we are in the church, or we are in other kinds of leadership, it's a good time to draw from the rich life of Winston Churchill. I love this picture, and it's a good departure point for us. Obviously, there's been a bombing. Perhaps this is London. Other officials are standing around, uncertain, fearful. And there's Churchill, resolute, cigar in mouth, dressed as he always was, but angry, resolute, fierce, determined. That's who Winston Churchill is, and that's what he can embed in our lives as we face the crisis that we face. Now, if you've studied leadership, if you have studied the different theories of leadership, then you have seen these theories of leadership before. If you've taken a class on leadership, read a book on leadership, you've seen all of these before. And all of these different theories of leadership play an important role in our understanding of leadership and in how we ought to lead. They all have some role. Churchill added to these. He certainly lived and implemented all of these, whether he would have called them by these names or not. But Churchill added to this something that was perhaps loftier. He spoke of the human spirit. He spoke of supernatural things. He spoke of matters like poetry and beauty and the future. It wasn't that he was just a poet. It wasn't that he was just a person who dealt with the emotional factors in leadership. He certainly understood and had a firm grasp on the practical. But Churchill believed in the invisible factors of leadership and believed we might even call them the supernatural factors of leadership. Just consider this quote, for example, one of his best about the whole issue of facing crises. He said, "The destiny of mankind is not decided by material computation. When great causes are on the move, we learn that we are spirits and that something is going on beyond space and time." Notice the language: destiny, spirits, something beyond space and time. I'm not suggesting this is all that Churchill built his leadership approach on, but it certainly was an element of it, an important element of it. I would say the bedrock of it, and it distinguished his brand of leadership. He wanted the technical, he wanted the practical, he understood factories, he understood munitions, he understood statistics. He just didn't think that you led only with those in hand. Consider this humorous quote that he's well known for. He said, "We want a lot of engineers in the world, but we do not want a world of engineers." Now, this rings a smile. But of course, what he was saying was we obviously value the technical, we obviously value the statistical, the mechanical, the practical things of life, but that's not all there is in the world. In other words, we do not want a world of engineers. We do not want everything to be about that. We need these other factors that he's already mentioned. Let's just briefly consider what he faced in his life and the degree of change he had to confront before we talk about his principles of leadership. He was born in 1874. That year, the electric streetcar came online. One of the big innovations that was celebrated around the world was a piano with pedals, and very, very rudimentary electric cooking utensils were developed that year. The year before, the big innovation was barbed wire. A few years after he was born, the very primitive version of Edison's telephone was developed. So he lived in an age that was forward-looking. He lived in an age that was somewhat technological, but he absolutely was not born in an advanced time. Now, he did not die until 1965. Consider that life just for a moment, 1874 to 1965. Just look at some of the things he was actually involved in developing during his life. He actually helped develop oil-burning ships. He had the idea for the tank, one of the ideas anyway. He suggested airborne machine guns, encouraged radar, had the idea for chaff, and was involved in the development of undersea pipelines. A pretty amazing degree of technological forethought for a man who was born in 1874. By the way, just a few years after the American Civil War. Perhaps that helps you locate it in time. This poster was all over England during World War II, and I believe it captures Winston Churchill's philosophy of leadership. Conduct yourself in crisis in such a way that you deserve victory. Conduct yourself in such a way that you deserve victory. Live and conduct yourself so that victory comes. And now let's look at some of the principles of Winston Churchill's approach to crisis leadership. And the first that we have to consider, and the first that is incumbent upon leaders, is that they frame the crisis. Many leaders fail to do this. When you face a crisis and you are leading people, you need to frame it. You need to put it in perspective. You need to make it understandable to people. You need to make sure that you put it express it in terms that people can understand and then act. Now, Churchill, facing World War II, could have said that it was the last battle of World War I, that it was about German bitterness over the peace treaty that ended World War I. He could have said it was about technical matters. He could have said it was about territory. He could have said that it was about socioeconomic factors. Instead, he certainly framed the war in other ways, but broadly he used these terms. He said this is a battle between Christian civilization and non-Christian civilization. He called Nazism that barbarous paganism called Nazism. He spoke of the general paganism and hedonism. Now, Churchill certainly framed the war in other terms, but this was the broad grid of understanding that he put upon the crisis. This was the way he encouraged people to understand it. It was not just motivational language, though in a far more Christian time, this certainly would have aroused people and summoned them to the cause. But this really was the way he understood it. He spoke of Hitler being evil. He spoke of Nazism being barbarous and paganism and vile. He believed that the Nazi racism and anti-Semitism was born, as he once said, in the pit of hell. This is the understanding, this is the grid, this is the framing he put on the crisis. And he used other schemes of understanding too. But the important lesson is that you frame the crisis for those you lead. Then, second of all, Churchill would invoke destiny. He would urge people to consider that when they were facing a crisis, that they were destined for it, that they had been made for such a time as this, that God had prepared them for what they were facing. He said, as he stepped into high office once, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And so rather than simply acting as though hard things were surprises and shocks and outside of what we ought to expect, instead he said, we were destined for this. We were called for this. We are, to use his phrase, walking with destiny. This was not just simply a motivational technique. This was not simply intended to incite the masses. This was what he genuinely believed and part of his approach to the entire crisis. Then third, one of the most important things a leader needs to do is define victory. What are we shooting for? What are we trying to accomplish? What does victory look like? What's the ultimate goal? Now listen to what Churchill said during the war. If we can stand up to Hitler, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. That sentence right there captures all of what free Europe was trying to accomplish, the Western world was trying to accomplish. It may sound simple, but most leaders neglect to define what victory looks like, neglect to show the future. Churchill spoke often of the future. If the British Empire should last 1,000 years, they will say this was our finest hour. Let us so conduct ourselves that we earn the world that our children will live in. He spoke about this all the time, having first painted very specifically what victory looks like. So in the crises that you face as you lead people, what does victory look like? To put it in almost silly terms, when you're sitting at a dinner long after the crisis is over and celebrating being on the other side, what is it exactly you'll be celebrating? And by the way, what kind of people will you have wanted to be during the crisis so that you achieve victory? Another very, very important principle of facing crises in a Churchillian mode is that you redefine hardship. Crises, by their nature, bring hardship upon us. They force us to do difficult things. They force suffering upon us. In our age in particular, but frankly in every age, certainly in the Western world where we've had such comfort and such ease, if you don't redefine hardship and make it almost a friend, almost a tool of victory, almost the price of victory, then people will see everything that's hard as bad. And that's not true. What you have to do is help them understand, by the way, not just in crises, but in all of life, that the hard things actually come as friends to make us better. Hardship is the price of victory. Hardship changes us to make us equal to victory. Churchill said, "We shall draw from the heart of suffering itself the means of inspiration and survival." Extremely important. Now, one of the ones that leaders often have a hard time doing is determining reality. Consultants tell us all the time that getting an organization to determine institutional reality is very, very difficult because people live with myths. People live with their wish list. People speak of wishes as though they were facts. You have to determine what reality is. Churchill said the truth is incontrovertible. Panic may resent it. Ignorance may deride it. Malice may destroy it. But there it is. I like something that Churchill said about politics once in his life. He said no one in great authority had the wit, ascendancy, or detachment from public folly to declare these fundamental, brutal facts to the electorate. There are always fundamental, brutal facts we have to face in a crisis. If we allow our wishes, we allow our fantasies, we allow myths to blind us to the brutal facts, then we will not know how to act. And also, we'll be setting up those we leave for disillusionment. And nothing is worse in a crisis than disillusionment. It's a major step towards surrender. Now, Churchill modeled for us also the idea that you have to act. Listen to this quote. "Things do not get better by being left alone. Unless they are adjusted, they explode with a shattering detonation." Churchill believed in action, and a lot of his job as prime minister was to get a rather sleepy British bureaucracy to get up and at it. One of the techniques he used was a sticker that would go on orders, and it said "action this day." Everyone knew what that sticker meant. It meant that the prime minister expected action on this order today. If a private showed up with orders such as this to a general's office, and it had "action this day" on it, that general knew that he was accountable by his higher ups to act on that order that day. And so action is important. We are, as human beings, we tend to insulate ourselves from action. We tend to insulate ourselves from reality in our heads and by our actions. And so we have to be stirred to act, to actually do the things we know to do. And Churchill insisted upon that. And of course, it led to victory. But not everything that Churchill used to bring about victory in crisis was always a matter of hardship and difficulty. He believed in humor. He said, in my belief, you cannot deal with the most serious things unless you also understand the most amusing. And Churchill was famous for using humorous moments that he knew would be repeated, by the way. It would help to, perhaps we could say in a modern term, set his brand or establish a truth. And he did this often. He used these moments and he would script them. Here's an example. Early in the war, Churchill was visiting the U.S. and he was staying at the White House. And it was at a time when the U.S. was helping England a great deal, and many in Congress were whispering that Churchill was lying to the United States, that he was inflating the numbers, inflating the need, that he was hiding the real situation, and he wasn't being truthful with the U.S., while the U.S., of course, was sending him a lot of material. So Churchill, as he was staying at the White House, was taking one of his famous midday baths. He used to bathe midday. And he was just emerging from the bath, picture it now, all pink and bulbous and wrapped in a towel, when Franklin Roosevelt was wheeled into his room. Of course, there hadn't been communication, and so they didn't know that Churchill was taking his bath at that moment. Well, Roosevelt was an aristocratic New Englander, and he was very, very aghast that he had been wheeled into the Prime Minister of England's room. There's Churchill again, dripping wet, pink, bulbous, wrapped in a towel, holding it together with one hand. And Roosevelt immediately asked to be wheeled out of the room. Churchill raised his hand to stop Roosevelt, and then he said, I have nothing to hide from the President of the United States. And he pulled the towel away. So now there stands Winston Churchill, naked, dripping wet, pink from his hot bath, pink with his big bulbous body. But he's making a point. And it was a point, by the way, it was a story that he knew would be repeated many, many times, particularly up on the Hill, particularly to Congress. And here I am, decades and decades and decades later, still telling the story. Why? Because it was told, and that's what Churchill intended. There were many, many others like this. When in big debates and in conflicts, he would use humor. This is a weapon that ought to be in the arsenal of every leader. And if you aren't good at it naturally, I suggest you buy a joke book. Get people to script things for you. Humor is important. People need the relief of it. They need to see their leaders are relaxed. And of course, everybody just enjoys a good laugh. And then also, leaders often neglect to embody the change. Now, we hear the young saying today, be the change you want to see, and that's valuable. It's a sort of a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. But Churchill believed in it very strongly. Embody the change, be not just the symbol, but the actual action, the actual representation of the change you want to see. He said it was a nation and a race dwelling all around the globe that had the lion heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar. See, that's how he thought of himself. The people are great, but they needed the roar of that lion spirit in the people to achieve things. When the Nazis would bomb London, Churchill wouldn't hide in the cabinet war rooms. He wouldn't hide in the shelters. He would go to the tops of buildings and sit there and watch the bombing. Now, obviously, he was putting himself in harm's way. And many times he would take his revolver and go stand on the top of those buildings and shoot at the planes, at the German planes. Well, no one thought he was going to bring down a plane. But the fact is that he was symbolizing something. And this was genuine, by the way. Was there a little bit of theater in it? Probably. But the fact is that he was symbolizing what he wanted the British people to be. This is very important, that leaders not just be bureaucrats and send out orders and call for performance standards, but they embody the spirit they want their people to be possessed of. And then Churchill was very big, and this is what lives on long after him and will for centuries, I believe. He remembered the poetry. He remembered the beauty of life. He would speak as a leader in terms that would inspire people, paint the future, capture the poetry of life, give speeches where he was talking about the devotion of mothers, or the care for the young, or how we must watch out for the elderly, or how he wanted everyone in every pub to raise a glass to a certain in other words, that sense of common life and the beauty of it. was something he lived very much in terms of. He said, expert knowledge, however indispensable, is no substitute for a generous and comprehending outlook upon a human story with all its sadness, with all its unquenchable hope. So Churchill kept his approach to leadership very close to the beauty and the hardships of mankind, and people responded to it. So there are all the pillars, but here is what Churchill believed most. This is what drew him into his approach to crisis leadership, into his approach to leadership as a whole. He said, "What is the use of living if it be not to strive for noble causes and to make this muddled world a better place to live in after we are gone? What is the use of living if it be not to strive for noble causes?" That's what leadership is. And that's what crisis leadership is. You develop the techniques, the tactics, the weapons for striving for noble causes, but you never forget that you're battling for a noble cause. We're not just trying to defeat coronavirus. We're trying to strive for the noble cause of care for people in the world and what our society will look like on the other side, and how we will have a more equitable system, and how we will love, and how we will serve, and what kind of people we will be on the other side. And to use Churchillian terms, when we're raising a glass somewhere with family or friends 6 months, a year from now, what kind of people will we have been in the battle? What kind of people will we have been in the crisis? And what kind of world will we have fashioned for ourselves? That's what we want to be celebrating, and that's what we want to have uppermost in our minds right now. Now, this is the book that this talk comes from. Get it or don't, but at least live out the principles that we've been talking about. Far more important than any book, far more important than this talk, is Winston Churchill. And as we look at this face just for a moment, let us think in terms of the challenge of previous generations. They suffered far more than we will, even with this great crisis upon us. And they're looking at us and they're saying, what will you do now? This is one of the great battles of your age. This is one of the great crises of your time. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, people will die. Yes, there will be trauma. What kind of people will you be? I believe that we want to be a Churchillian people. I believe we want to be a victorious people. I believe we want to be a people who lead and conduct ourselves well in this great coronavirus age, and fashion the world that we want to hand to the next generation.